stick for Scotland, Jack Rankin.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the whole House would like to pay tribute to artist Jack Vetriano, who sadly died this week, the son of a methyl miner who taught himself to paint our country is a little less colourful for his passing. And Mr Speaker, can I express my thanks to you and members across this House for the very many kind words following the birth of my daughter Lois. She was born at home 2 hours before the midwives could arrive, so I suppose you could always say I'm delivering for Scotland. Many members have asked me consistently how I'm coping with the tears, snotters and tantrums, but I remind them I've been on paternity leave, so I haven't had time to keep up with SNP selection dramas. Mr Speaker, to the question. It's been a historic week for our country, and I know the people of Scotland stand with Ukraine and will recognise the importance of this government's decision to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. The Prime Minister's leadership on the world stage should be a source of pride for all those who value Britain's role as a defender of democracy and a partner for European peace. Scotland has never been more ready to play its part in defending the UK and their allies.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Scotland's world-class defence industry will play a key role in rebuilding Britain's military capabilities. On my visit to Babcock at Rosyth, I saw first-hand how defence spending benefits Scotland's SMEs. But investment in Scotland's defence SMEs lags far behind the rest of the United Kingdom, accounting for just 2.5% of the MOD's total spend, largely due to the hostile environment created by the SNP. How is the Secretary of State working with the MOD and Scotland's defence industry to unleash Scotland's SMEs and enhance our nation's defence capabilities?
Mr Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question and for the cross-parliament support for the Prime Minister's actions on Ukraine and indeed defence. Scotland needs all its political leaders to proudly stand up for our defence industry. Scotland has led the UK in defence and has been home to its nuclear deterrent since the 1960s. I recently hosted a defence industry roundtable to discuss sector priorities and opportunities, and as part of our Brand Scotland programme, I have discussed those in Norway and South East Asia. I welcome the announcement by the Prime Minister of new SME spending targets for defence. This will boost access to UK defence investment, unlocking new jobs in the process.
Johnny Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the SNP's reckless pledge to scrap our nuclear deterrent at Faz Lane significantly threatens our national security at a time of significant international and does he agree that Trident, when the First Minister said that Trident has no tangible or realistic benefit to our current security challenges, does the Secretary of State share my view that the stance is fundamentally naive and demonstrates that the SNP cannot be trusted with Scotland's future?
Can I thank the honourable lady for that question? And indeed, the First Minister is all over the place in terms of defence. He suggested that we should increase the 2.5% of GDP on defence spending by scrapping Trident. That's already included in the 2.5%, so would have made no difference whatsoever. They're not credible at all on defence in Scotland, and I would urge everyone in this House, every single party, to get behind the Prime Minister in our national interest.
Dr Scott Arthur.
Question number 2, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Employment Rights Bill will represent the biggest upgrade of workers' rights in a generation, banning zero-hours contracts, ending unscrupulous fire and rehire, day-one protections for paternity leave and against unfair dismissal, better access to statutory sick pay. And with International Women's Day fast approaching, we should remember that it is working women who will disproportionately benefit from this groundbreaking legislation. That's what change looks like. That's the difference a Labour government makes.
Dr Scott Arthur.
I thank the Minister for her reply. Residents right across Edinburgh South West welcome the improvements to workers' rights, but parents in my constituency are really concerned about the impact of the growing gap in attainment in Scottish schools between the richest and poorest, and what that means for their children finding their first job. This week I've been inundated with comments from parents who are concerned about the recent Audit Scotland report on support for children with additional support needs in Scotland. Absolutely disgraceful report. Can the Minister assure me that she will use whatever influence she has to ensure the Scottish Government makes education a priority?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend rightly raises the concerns of parents worried about their kids getting good jobs. But the SNP have said that a zero-hours contract was a positive destination for a school leaver. This Labour government will ban such exploitative contracts. Labour's budget delivered an extra £4.9 billion for Scottish public services. If after 18 years the SNP still don't see Scottish kids as a priority, they should stand aside and give Scotland the chance for the new direction it deserves.
Jim Shannon.
you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the response, but more importantly, can I thank the honourable gentleman for Edinburgh South West for setting the scene. He's very clearly outlined the issues and the importance to having children and the opportunities for children to be there. So can I ask the Minister, with that in mind, opportunities for children, has the Minister had an opportunity to talk to the equivalent Minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly to discuss how better we can help our children in Northern Ireland, and as you wish to do in Scotland? Thank you.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't had that chance, but I'd be delighted to do so. Scottish education has, of course, devolved to the SNP government. I think members on the benches opposite should think long and hard about the fact they've claimed it's their #1 priority, and yet the attainment gap is growing. Working class kids' education exam results were explicitly downgraded by the serving First Minister. We would be delighted to partner with anyone across these islands who wants to increase educational opportunity for our young people.
Grangemouth.
Question 3, please, Mr. Speaker.
Stay.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3, 6, 8 and 10 together. The Scotland Office is playing a key role in driving economic growth in Scotland, ensuring our new industrial strategy works for Scotland, securing Harland and Wolff's future to protect hundreds of jobs in Arnish and Methil, and I led the cross-government ministerial task force to secure £200 million from the National Wealth Fund for Grangemouth. Over the next 10 years, the UK Government will directly invest £1.4 billion in local growth projects in Scotland, from the V&A in Dundee, the town centre of Elgin, a free port in the Forth and local travel in Paisley. Our plan for change will bring growth to every part of Scotland.
Ishman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The formal redundancy consultation process started last week for laboratories and stores within the Grangemouth site, with emergency response and other shared service consultations also about to start. These redundancies are due to Petra Ineos serving notice to end shared service contracts because of the imminent refinery closure. The Prime Minister announced a support package guaranteeing workers' incomes for 18 months. So, will the Secretary of State reassure the shared services workers about to lose their jobs in the Grangemouth site because of the refinery closure that they too will be eligible for this package of income guarantee and reskilling support from Forth Valley College?
So stay.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this in the House, as he does, protecting workers in his constituency. The UK Government is fully committed to seeking a sustainable industrial future for Grangemouth and all its workers. Mr. Speaker, following the work of the Scotland Office-led task force, the Prime Minister announced the National Wealth Fund will provide £200 million of investment for the Grangemouth site. The UK Government, working with the Scottish Government, is providing a training guarantee for all staff at the refinery to support them into good jobs. And the Honourable Gentleman will be pleased to hear that Unite the Union has welcomed the funding and said that the package, and I quote, safeguards Scotland's energy security and delivers jobs for the future.
Dr. Juven Sunder.
Speaker, the defence sector contributes £3.2 billion to the Scottish economy, and Scotland's contribution keeps us all safe. The Prime Minister announced increased defence spending in our country. That also means more investment in Scotland, higher industrial production and higher incomes. So does the Minister agree with me that this shows the difference the Labour government makes both south and north of the border?
Thursday.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is absolutely right when he says the first responsibility of this government is to protect our national security and keep our citizens safe. The last time that defence spending was at 2.5% of GDP was under the last Labour government. Scotland is a leader in the defence industry. Just this week I had the pleasure of visiting JFD in Renfrew, who work with the Royal Navy to design, manufacture and operate world-class submarine rescue systems. From Babcock and B&A to small businesses and start-ups, I'm determined that Scotland leads the way in building our military industrial base.
Chris Vance.
More than 20,000 jobs in Scotland already support the defence sector, including as well as hundreds of jobs in Harlow. Does he agree that the government's commitment to increase defence spending will also help to grow Scotland's economy and create more skilled jobs?
Thursday.
Thanks for that question, Mr. Speaker. For years, the defence sector in Scotland has been at the forefront of creating skilled, well-paid jobs, despite the SNP's refusal to stand up and back UK defence. Mr. Speaker, this week is of course Scottish Apprenticeship Week as well, and I hope those on all sides of the House, particularly members from Scotland, will join me in paying tribute to Scotland's wonderful defence sector apprentices who do a great job not just keeping our country safe but helping their economies grow and the skills base of Scotland's future.
Adam Jogi.
Proper industrial strategy is key to economic growth, which is why industry has been asking for this for many years. My constituents in Newcastle and Lyme were failed by the Tories, and the people of Scotland have been failed by the SNP since 2007. Can the Minister set out what work the Scotland Office across government's done to ensure that a national new industrial strategy delivers for Scotland, as well as the good people of Newcastle under Lyme?
Thursday.
Mr. Speaker, the SNP Scottish Government and its members seem to think that defending the defence industry is done on Twitter. Mr Speaker, this government inherited not just a fiscal crisis but an industrial one as well over 10 years without a clear industrial strategy. I was pleased to meet recently with the Chair of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council and welcomed my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, to Scotland last month to meet business leaders at the forefront of Scotland's industrial future. Already this government has delivered, amongst other things, £200 million for Grangemouth, £2.6 million for the V&A in Dundee, job security for 300 skilled workers at Harland and Wolff shipyards in Bethel and Arnish, and just this morning we announced £55 million for the Crompty Green Freeport to expand its capability for floating offshore wind. That's a commitment to growth this government makes to the country.
Lamont.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The SNP government continues to be opposed to nuclear energy, despite the huge economic benefits it would bring to Scotland. We can see this from the jobs and investment that Torness Power Station generates. So does the Minister agree with me that investing in nuclear would help bring down bills for consumers, help the environment and create many more jobs?
Secretary of State.
I couldn't agree more with the right honourable gentleman. We should be having a nuclear policy in Scotland that allows us to have nuclear power to bring down bills and give us that energy security. And of course, he's also right. The SNP are against nuclear power in Scotland, but they're very happy to take the base load from England.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Mr Speaker, the Scotch whisky industry is central to the economic growth of Scotland, and I was very pleased to hear at the dispatch box yesterday that EFRA are not moving forward with their consultation in relation to single malt. But can the Secretary of State explain why we were in this position in the first place? What consultation was had between EFRA and the Scotland office before this consultation was opened?
The honourable lady, in terms of the commitment that was given by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury at this dispatch box yesterday, and I just reiterate that the only watering down of whisky in Scotland will be the little bit of water that some put in it to taste it.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State will be well aware of the manifold range of family businesses, family-owned businesses in Scotland, many of whom are very large, trading multi-million-pound balance sheets every single year. The Chancellor's move to change the rules around business property relief threaten, at best, these businesses potentially getting sold off to PLCs and, at worst, them getting liquidated to pay for their liabilities to HMRC. What assessment has the Scotland Office done on the potentially catastrophic implications for Scottish enterprise of the BPR changes in train from the Treasury?
Mr Speaker, it seems to be that SNP members, when they came back to this chamber back in July, have decided to defend the Conservative government's economic record. We inherited a £22 billion black hole. The Chancellor, when she came to this dispatch box for the budget, had to fill that black hole and end austerity, which is what we promised. It delivered £4.9 billion to the Scottish budget, which the honourable gentleman's party is intent on spending. And Mr Speaker, this is the key point in all of this. This is the key point here. The SNP members in this House have objected to every single measure in that budget, but they're very happy to spend the money.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the Secretary of State wants to help economic growth in Scotland, can I suggest he looks at oil and gas, ending licensing of domestic production, which will not make the slightest difference to how much we consume, will lead to the loss of tens of thousands of jobs, 35,000 jobs, billions of pounds in tax revenue, and we will then import the oil and gas with higher embedded emissions. The Secretary of State knows that's crazy. Can he use it? He can't say so publicly at the dispatch box, but can he use his good offices to persuade his fellow Cabinet members that this is not a sensible course for Scotland?
Mr Speaker, this government backs the oil and gas industry in Scotland. We've consistently said that oil and gas will be with us for decades to come, but that sits across our side. Our national mission to get to clean power by 2030. It's a mission that we should all be backing, not just for the jobs of the future, but to bring down people's bills as well.
Right, Shadow Secretary of State, Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And can I add my congratulations to that of many others on the birth of the Secretary of State's child just recently. Mr Speaker, I read with some interest that the leader of the Scottish Labour Party is considering publishing a league table to rank the performance of his Scottish Labour MPs. I won't ask the Secretary of State to answer where he thinks he might sit on that table, but I do want to ask about jobs and the economy, specifically in relation to the energy industry. As a direct result of the eco-zealotry emanating from the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, the increase in the Energy Profits Levy, the ban on new licences and the refusal to even defend the issuing of licences to Rosebank and Jackdaw, there will be a reduction in the total economic value of the oil and gas sector of £13 billion over the next 4 years, with 35,000 direct jobs at risk. Can the Secretary of State tell the House, as Scotland's man in the Cabinet, the man on whom we all rely to make Scotland's case and for Scotland's interest, has he made any overtures to his beleaguered colleague at Desnes, or indeed the Treasury, to stop this madness?
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State will know that the Government is working very hard after the Finch decision and the decisions around Rosebank in terms of oil and gas, and he asks me to answer the question about where Scottish Labour MPs would rank in that table. Scottish Labour MPs on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, are in the Premier League. He's in the Sunday League.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as my right honourable friend says, there's nothing wrong with the Sunday Leagues. Just as he and Scottish Labour were silent on gender recognition, just as he and Scottish Labour are silent on taxing family businesses and farms out of existence, he and Scottish Labour are silent on the loss of an entire industry and its workforce, which will decimate the north east of Scotland and indeed impact the entire UK economy. So if he and indeed his Scottish Labour colleagues are not standing up for Scotland's interest, for Scottish workers and Scottish industry, can he tell me what just is the point of Scottish Labour?
Mr. Speaker, this Government is fully committed to economic growth, and as I've said already, the Prime Minister has said and the Chancellor has consistently said oil and gas will be with us for decades to come. We support the industry. We're working through the issues that have been risen by the legal cases that has been referenced by the Shadow Secretary of State, and our Clean Power mission by 2030 will create jobs, create that economic growth, lower bills and give us that energy security for the future.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If economic growth in Scotland is to succeed, our world-class universities, the knowledge, the skills and the jobs that they provide will be absolutely vital. Last week, Edinburgh University announced that they face a £140 million deficit, projected to be the largest in the UK. That's hugely concerning for my constituents, and I'm sure also for the Minister. The principals cited several issues, including the national insurance changes. And this morning, visiting universities told Scottish MPs that they also have funding concerns, and they cited the immigration laws in this country as a disincentive. So, can he tell us, please, what the Government is going to do to stop further damage to this vital sector, inhibiting economic growth?
Mr. Speaker, Scottish universities punch above their weight internationally. They're one of the jewels in the crown of not just the Scottish economy, but the Scottish and UK education system. And of course, Edinburgh University is the best university in the world. You'd expect me to say that as the MP in Edinburgh, but also an alumni itself. Let's not hide from the fact, and I say gently to the Honourable Lady, that part of the big funding challenges with universities is the lack of funding from the Scottish Government, because higher education is devolved. And I also follow that up by very gently saying to the Honourable Lady that, again, she is saying that she doesn't want anything in the budget that raises funds, but wants to spend it.
Stephen Gathins.
Mr. Speaker, can I join others in congratulating the Secretary of State on the arrival and the birth of his daughter? That's one gain from Labour that even we can endorse, Mr. Speaker. One of the most important areas that business has identified for growth has been around a more Scotland-specific approach to migration. That's something that was touted by Scottish Labour in their manifesto and by their leader, but was shot down by the UK Government within no time at all, going the same way as WASPI, child poverty commitments and the winter fuel payment commitment. So if the UK Government won't listen to Scotland's Labour leader, why should anybody else?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very surprised that the honourable gentleman didn't take the opportunity to apologise for his Twitter rantings at the weekend on foreign policy with regards to the Prime Minister, and what he said was the UK has left itself in an utterly isolated position. I think the honourable gentleman left himself in an utterly isolated position. This Government is completely committed to economic growth, completely committed to transforming lives in Scotland, and we're also already seeing the fruits of that in the Scottish context. And I would ask the SNP to either get behind that or give Scotland a new direction and get out of the way.
Stephen Gathins.
If the Minister had bothered to read any more deeply, I was saying something that he once agreed with. Leaving the EU left us more isolated. He once agreed with me about that before he went into government. But then he agreed with me on other things before he went into government, like tackling fuel poverty, tackling child poverty. Or is the Secretary of State no longer worried about these issues and more worried about league tables? Or a situation where he's more worried about being in the relegation zone? Do you know what's really interesting, Mr. Speaker? Throughout all of this, not once has he stood up for his leader. So it makes me think that if we shouldn't listen to his leader because they're not listening to his leader anymore either.
State.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I lost the thread of that question about halfway through, but the one thing I did take from the question is it was absolutely identical to the question from the Tory Shadow Secretary of State. That tells you all you need to know.
Hurry up, Ross.
Question number 4.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Economic growth is this government's #1 mission. These changes to national insurance contributions are being made in the context of a resilient labour market, with the estimated employment rate up 0.9 percentage points over the last quarter of 2024. We are creating jobs and opportunity through our plan for change and truly making work pay to help raise living standards right across the UK.
Hurry across.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Labour government's decision to hike national insurance is a cost on business before they even open their doors.
Yep.
And in recent months, I've spoken to many businesses across my Gordon Buchan constituency, and each has said to me how worried they are about the changes. In response to my recent business survey, one large business in my constituency said that they're looking to cut up to 25 jobs because of the next changes, and saying that it is beyond belief that the Labour government have decided to do this. Given that this example will be replicated in constituencies across Scotland, including the ministers, can she really stand at this dispatch box and say that she believes in this policy, which so directly hits jobs, employment and growth across Scotland?
Mr. Speaker, I do believe in this policy in the same way I believe in all of the announcements that were made in this budget. As so often, members on the opposite benches, they will the ends of the budget, but not the means. If you want the changes to public services that our constituents both rely on, you need to have revenue that pays for it, and that's what this budget was all about. Cleaning up the mess that we inherited and getting investment into the public services that so desperately required.
Brent Downey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we know, one of the best ways to grow employment in Scotland is through apprenticeships. A few weeks ago, this UK Labour government announced changes to apprenticeships in England, which will allow businesses to work more closely with colleges and with other skills providers to make sure there's a job at the end of apprenticeships. While in Scotland, all we see is stagnation in skills policy, reducing opportunities for young people in my constituency and across the country. Will she use all her efforts to make sure we press the Scottish Government to properly reform apprenticeships in Scotland to give young people and others the opportunities that they need and deserve?
Mr. Speaker, I certainly will, and I'd like to pay tribute to my honourable friend for all that he does to promote apprentices and skills, and in particular the apprentices in our defence industry who are doing so much to keep Scotland, the UK and indeed the world safe.
Andrew Bowies, Shadow Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State said that the questions just asked were similar. Well, at 2 attempts we didn't get an answer to either of the questions, so we might try on farming. Scotland's beef sector is at the heart of Scottish agriculture, with 80% of the country's agricultural land being grazing land, and yet domestic beef production levels are set to reduce by 5%, with a 12% increase in imports expected to meet our forecasted demand. It's clear this government's tax changes couldn't come at a worse time for Scotland's farmers. So will this Minister please stand up for Scotland's farmers and make the case to stop this madness?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is perfectly aware that currently 73% of agricultural property relief claims each year are for less than £1 million. So almost 3/4 of estates claiming the relief are expected to be entirely unaffected. According to the latest data from HMRC, 40% of APR is claimed by just 7% of estates making claims. That means that just 117 estates across the UK were claiming over £200 million of relief in 2021-22. Farmers will be able to pass down their family farm to future generations, just as they always have done.
Susan Murray.
5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Properly funding public services and restoring economic stability requires difficult decisions on tax, which is why we are asking employers to contribute more. Stabilising the public finances is the only way to create long-term stability in which businesses can thrive. The Government does recognise the need to protect the smallest businesses, which is why we have more than doubled the employment allowance to £10,500, meaning more than half of small businesses will either gain or be unaffected.
Sit down. Susan Murray. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents has told me about one of their clients who's a business care home owner, which is facing an increase in their operating costs of £70,000 a year as a result of the national insurance increase. Most of their caring staff work on a part-time basis, which suits their family circumstances. However, for each part-time member of staff, the business must pay an additional £615 per year as a result of the change to the National Insurance contribution thresholds in the Government's October budget. In Bartonshire and across the UK, there's a growing demand for social care. So, what is the Government going to do to help businesses in the care sector who've been hit by these increased staffing costs at a time when there are significant rises?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure the honourable member from Mid Bartonshire and members on all sides of this House will join me in paying tribute to Scotland's social care workers for the incredible contribution that they make. Social care is, of course, a devolved issue. The Scottish Government has now received the largest budget settlement in the whole history of devolution, in addition to support for additional employer national insurance costs. They can choose to, and indeed I very much hope they do, deliver additional support for social care.
You stand by. Speaker, the impact of next changes in the budget is £5.2 billion more for Scotland. Record funding to invest in our NHS, protect the successes of devolution and fix our local services. But the Scottish Government have squandered the latter opportunity by continuing to underfund our councils, leaving Falkirk Council with a £28 million hole to plug after 8 years of SNP control. Does the Minister agree with me that the £5.2 billion secured for Scotland by these benches could have been used to fix local government, but instead the SNP have chosen to leave the people of Falkirk to pick up the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only do I agree with my honourable friend that the SNP government is at risk of squandering this historic opportunity for Scotland, I suggest the SNP government might like to ask their members of Parliament opposite why they voted against this historic budget in Scotland's interests.
We now come to Prime Minister